let us get started. I welcome you all to this afternoon's conference, Shaping Our Everyday Prayer. I just want to get a few more, there we go. Especially welcome you on behalf of the sponsors, the group, the Joint Liturgical Group of Great Britain. And I'm Anna Gobeldale. I'm a member of the Joint Liturgical Group representing the United Reformed Church. The Joint Liturgical Group is an ecumenical endeavor which for almost 60 years has united Christian churches, denominations, and movements to both create shared worship resources and to comment to our churches on worship matters and to listen as well. Much of the liturgical work that the group produces can be found on the website, and that link will be shared a couple of times today so that you have it easily accessible. But you can always just search Joint Liturgical Group in Great Britain. Today's conference is our annual educational event, which historically has been held in London. Thanks to Zoom, it's available to all of you today. It's just been lovely to see where everyone's coming from, including Spain. We invite you, as I mentioned, those of you who've just come on, to add your location beside your name on the screen so that we can really marvel at the reach of this event. We welcome our two presenters who will help us look at shaping our everyday prayer, Father David Birchall and Reverend Peter Gardner, both of you in Glasgow. Thank you for being with us and welcome. You'll both be fully introduced before your individual presentations. And I also want to just take a moment to thank the IT team. It's from Salisbury United Reformed Church. You'll see on their names it says IT team, Elaine, Fiona, Joan, and Anne. Wonderful to have you all supporting this event, and they're making it happen a lot, so thanks to them. Our program will open with worship, followed by Father Birchall's presentation. Then we'll have a very brief comfort break, but feel free, you're in your home, wherever you are, get up as you need to, stretch, watch from afar. I'll leave your personal health up to you, but there will be a short comfort break. And then we'll hear from Peter, who will also lead our closing worship, and we'll end at 5:30. Before we have our opening time of worship, one quick comment about money. As it said in all the promotion, there is no registration fee today, but there are costs for the day. Donations will be accepted gratefully towards these costs and towards ongoing work of the Joint Liturgical Group, which we continue to have costs in the future. A PayPal link, it is available. It's through Salisbury United Reformed Church, but don't be confused. Once you get to the webpage, it's clear again. It is for the Joint Liturgical Group, and then you'll get on PayPal with Salisbury United Reformed Church, but Ray Crowther, our treasurer, knows that funds will be coming in today. And I just want to thank you in advance for any financial support that you'd like to give to the Joint Liturgical Group. So now let us turn our hearts and minds to worship. In our opening worship, we'll participate in two ways of praying. We're talking about everyday praying. And so these are the prayers for today, which is one of every day. The first is a prayer being open to God's inspiration through a daily prayer life, and secondly, through extraordinary encounters with the visual that invite us into a conversation with the divine. First, being inspired through one's daily prayer life, Karen Campbell is an ordained elder in the United Reformed Church and serves as secretary for global and intercultural ministries and missions. She's also a liturgist and someone who has a strong daily prayer life. And we're blessed by her willingness to jot down some of these daily prayers and then share them with the wider church. And today she's going to share a prayer I first heard at a session of the United Reformed Church's Black History Monthlies. It's a monthly program. With our focus today on both reflection and images in prayer, Karen asks God to help us see and hear that we might speak into injustice. Please join Karen in prayer.
This prayer is called Kairos. God, in whose likeness all are made, teach us to see each other as you see us, each individual, nation, and people, beautiful, beloved, valued beyond measure. Enable us to see as you see. God, who is love, teach us to love each other as you love us, from the very heart of who we are, embracing friend, embracing neighbor, embracing stranger, generous, self-giving, surmounting all barriers, real and perceived. Move us to love as you love. God, who is impartial, teach us to strive as you strive, raging with the oppressed, unsettling the comfortable, refusing to be stilled or quieted until your cries for justice are heard and echoed and lived into being. Stir us to be agents of challenge and change. God of justice, God who demands justice, move us from the inactive, safe, unsafe, silent place on the fence. Open our eyes now. Move us to listen now. Make us hear now. Speak out now. Speak up now. Struggle and move and act for justice right now in our world, our nation, our church today. Amen.
Amen. May it be so. Thank you, Karen, for sharing your words of prayer with us and for taking time out to join us here today to share that prayer. Our second prayer invites us to encounter the divine through a prayer inspired by Scripture. I think that'll be coming up now. And a textile installation, Threads Through Creation at Salisbury Cathedral. These are enormous applique hangings designed and created by Jackie Parkinson. Our prayer will lead us through this amazing art installation and the wonder and mystery of one of the biblical accounts of the miracle of creation. Joan Smith and Ann E. from Salisbury United Reformed Church will lead us in prayer.
Pray with me. Creator of the heavens and the earth, in the beginning was you. The earth was a formless void, shrouded in mystery and miracle. Darkness covered the face of the deep when you swept over the face of the waters as a great wind.
You spoke light into being and saw that it was good. You separated the light from the darkness, shining into day, shadows into night.
You spoke the dome of the heavens into being, spreading the sky to eternity.
Gathering the waters together.
Thank you for speaking this good creation into being, the dry land and the gathered waters together.
Thank you for the vegetation that springs forth from the land, for the plants yielding seed and fruit trees of every kind. We praise you for your goodness.
Thank you for the lights in the sky that separate the day from the night.
For the swarms of sea creatures.
Great crafter that you are, thank you for designing every living creature on the land and in the sea.
And in the air, every winged bird taking flight.
And thank you for bringing humanity into being. Remind us that you see goodness in all you have created, even in us. Forgive us for turning dominion into domination, stewardship into lordship. As so much of this amazing creation faces disaster, much caused by our own actions. Use us as crafters and designers of goodness. Use our voices in the image of your voice to speak goodness into being, to continue your plan for all creation.
So that you will once again see all that has been created and declare it good, so that the miracle and mystery of the land, the sea and the skies, the fragile beauty of all creation will continue in all its splendor to your glory. As we contemplate the everyday, make us mindful of the wonder that surrounds us. As we consider ways to communicate with you, fill us with possibilities. This we pray to you, Creator, Designer, and Speaker of goodness. Amen.
Thank you, Joan and Anne and Karen, for opening our gathering with prayer and devotion. So again, a few more latecomer or people have just come on. Welcome on behalf of the Joint Liturgical Group in Great Britain to our annual conference, Shaping Everyday Prayer. And we welcome our first presenter, Father David Birchall, who will lead us in imaginative contemplation and reflective prayer. Father Birchall joined the Jesuits in 1976 and was ordained in 1985. For 9 years, he was the director of St. Bueno's Jesuit Spirituality Center and is currently director of the Ignatian Spiritual Center in Glasgow. Welcome, Father Birchall.
Thank you. Just hope that I don't get the telephone here going off again. So I've been asked to give this talk on Ignatian Spirituality or Imaginative Contemplation. It's quite similar, really. I'm going to start with a screen share here. Right, it says the participants can now see it, so I presume you can. Good.
Yes,
Thank you, participants. Yeah. Good. This is a picture, by the way. This is a picture of Ignatius of Loyola in a place called Manresa, where he went through quite a bit of a dark night of the soul, I think. But out of that came a little book known as the Spiritual Exercises, which we get this imaginative contemplation from. Mainly, it's not necessarily his invention. It was going long before he was, and he was born in the when he was born in the 15th century and lived most of his life in the 16th, at the turn of that century. I suppose much of the Gospels, when you read the Gospels, when you think about them, there's no great descriptions in them. You know, you don't sort of get, it was a lovely day in Nazareth and the sun was shining on the flagstones, or it was pouring with rain by the Sea of Galilee. You get very little of detail of what goes on. You don't either get things like, you know, you hear Jesus calls Peter and James and John, and immediately they got up and followed him. It never says why. What convinced them to get up and follow him? We don't know. It doesn't say. They must have had a reason, you know, why you would leave fishing, a decent job of work, we presume, in that period. They actually owned the boats, the families, so they can't have been completely poor, and yet they got up and followed him. Why? We don't know. And so in these great spaces, if you like, of motivation, of reasons for things happening, we sort of put our own imagination. We put ourselves into the gospel stories. as I say, it's the method isn't itself new, but sometimes people find it new. We've been, oops, that's not right, sorry. Oh, something going on here. Okay, no, it's not right. We've, over the last few years, we've been particularly doing work over the Lenten period. And we've been doing this retreat, which involves a certain amount of group guidance, certain amount of personal sharing, personal prayer rather, and then a sort of group sharing. The first time we started it in 2018, we had a lot of this imaginative prayer, and we would sort of gave people instructions on how to do it. And we did it online, and we encouraged people, particularly in the Glasgow area of Scotland, where we have more contacts, to get together in groups. And so we had groups in parishes and in churches and different communities. And on the online thing, we found that there was about 500 people every day got together, getting onto our webpage to actually find what the different ways of praying. We thought this was a good idea, and people said, well, online's fine, but we would rather, in our groups, we would rather have something a bit more tangible. So we sort of, you can see that we produced these little books, which had the prayers and pictures, and we did that for a second year. The year before, what's it now? 2020, that was one. Last year, of course, we didn't do this because there was nowhere to give things out to. Everything was closed up. So we went into apps instead. But it was interesting. We had one gentleman in his 80s who said, this is great. I've been doing this all through Lent, and I find it's my greatest Lent I've ever lived. And now I'm 82. So they didn't do too badly. But there's a lot of people made on their comments from the evaluations, why haven't we heard about this way of praying before? It comes, as I say, from the spiritual exercises, which is a tiny little book. I was looking for my thinnest copy of it, which I can't find at the moment, but it's you know, it's like a little pamphlet, the original book, and it's really a guidebook to praying. And the suggestion is that people pray for a whole month, 5 times a day, for anything up to an hour in these 5 times. And it's divided off into 4 sections for weeks, as we call it, but some weeks are longer than other weeks. The first week looks a little more at sin and our own response to the Creator and what's really important in life. The second week follows Jesus on through his life, and we imagine in this that we are following him along the road, and we sort of are seeing the various things that are happening in Jesus's life and allowing ourselves to be a person in these stories of Jesus. Week 3 of the exercises looks at the last few days of Jesus's life, his passion, how he gave himself for us. And week 4 looks at the resurrection and how we live our life in love. The whole of the exercise is intended as a discernment, a choosing how I'm affected by good or bad. So it's how I'm affected by the positive or negative. In the terms of 16th century spirituality, it was very much God and the devil. However you look at it, though, it's how to follow a positive, a creative way of life, how to follow Christ in our lives. So what is the actual prayer about? Well, I'd like to start with this picture. I don't know if anybody has a clue as to what it might be a picture of. You are allowed to unmute and shout if you could work it out.
Road to Emmaus.
The road to Emmaus. Okay, the road to Emmaus. Thank you. And you see, it's an artist's view of the road to Emmaus. Two quite solid-looking characters and one character who's just an outline. What's that saying about what the artist sees of how Jesus is? An artist has to choose if he draws a picture of something like this, but it comes out of his imagination, or her imagination. I don't know whether it's a man or a woman drew this. And God speaks to us through our imagination. We sometimes feel that God can only speak through when we're actually thinking things out, you know, sort of, but I think we can find out all sorts of things through particularly through the surprises that come in our imagination. When we're imagining something, imagining we're in a gospel scene, what surprises us about the way things happen? I don't know. I find that if I really get into it, things happen and I let things happen and you sort of think, oh, I probably wouldn't have thought about that before. Things can happen which surprise us. And then we can say, oh, what's God saying about that? Why is it happening that way? Is it something that I'm not noticing in my daily life? There's all sorts of interesting things can come up through our own imagination. And I think the idea of getting in touch with this imagination is getting in touch too with how we feel about things, how we feel about people, to find out what motivates us, what are our deepest desires in life. Also to find out what brings us contentment, consolation, a sense of everything is right. What brings us a sense of unease, dissatisfaction, desolation. Now, this is not exactly a brand new thing. I don't know for some of it. Let's not try again. I don't know what's happening on my PowerPoint today. It's refusing to move. Oh, that's it. Anybody from the Catholic tradition would have probably been brought up, a lot of you look old enough to have been brought up on the Catechism. The Catechism has lots of questions and lots of answers. And question number 2 is, why did God make you? And for those of you who came across this, you can think of various answers, but the answer that we were supposed to, we got slapped if we didn't get right sometimes, awful schools we went to. God made me to know him, love him, and serve him in this world, and to be happy with him forever in the next. So that was a snappy enough answer. To know, to love, and to serve. It's very much the prayer of Richard of Chichester, of course. Know you more clearly, love you more dearly, and follow you more nearly. It's that sort of sense. And it's very much a sense that comes out in the spiritual exercise of Ignatius. He too likes that sense of knowing, loving, and following or serving. And the happiness is not just for the next. There's something about knowing, loving, and serving which brings joy and contentment in this world. It brings consolation and fulfillment, as opposed to desolation and emptiness. We hopefully know this as Christians, that when we're doing our best to follow Christ, to serve others, it makes us feel good. However, it doesn't always bring us to a quiet life. Serving God and neighbor may well bring ridicule, attacks, misunderstandings, poverty. But as I say, deep down, there is a sense of it's good for us and it fulfills us in what we should be doing. And so when planning our calling at any moment in life, and we do have moments of change of what we do in life, this imagination, I think, can be a great help in revealing to us how a particular plan of action might affect us, how we might feel it. We can imagine, for example, if we make a change of job, what it might be like in the job. We imagine that. Would I like it? Is it the sort of thing that would bring me contentment? And I've got to imagine myself doing these things. We're not, hopefully, just talking about imaginative contemplation, so we're going to do one now. So the suggestion is that we choose a passage from Scripture, we read it, we choose a time to dedicate to God in prayer. We say, okay, Lord, I'll give you the next 15 minutes in prayer, particularly, or the next half an hour, however long we think it might take. Our founder, Ignatius of Loyola, was very keen that you actually gave God the time and then just stuck with it, and didn't carry on longer if it was going well. Just say, well, thank you, and then go wanting more. And if it wasn't going so well, dedicate the time to God and just give God the time, because you never know, in the last minute of the prayer, you might get a great revelation. Who knows? So that's sort of handing over your time to God. We begin with a stilling. We recognize we're in God's presence and ask God to inspire us. And also, it's good to be aware of what we need too. What are we asking God for at the moment? What's the needs, the graces, sometimes we say. And then we set the scene, we move into it. The scene I want to choose today is Jesus and Peter walking on the water. I was thinking of maybe asking, I don't know if we've got a volunteer, anybody would like to read this passage of Scripture. I can't see hands and I can't see the people, so.
They can just unmute and start in.
Okay, well, only one person, please. So maybe it might be easier if Anna, if you do it, then.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And read the entire passage?
Yes, that's please, yes.
Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking towards them on the lake. But when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to Peter, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased.
Thank you. So that's basically the story. And if we look at the story, we've got Jesus we've got a group of disciples in the boat. It doesn't say who, apart from Peter. So there's a group of others in. So if we're going to imagine this story, then we might imagine ourselves as Peter. We might imagine ourselves as one of the other disciples that's watching from the boat, terrified. We could even imagine ourselves on the shore watching what's going on. So we're going to begin. What I'm going to do with this one, there's a backdrop, if you like, of water. You don't have to look at the water. It might make you seasick if you watch it too long. But it's just a blank, really, for the screen. And you can do this with your eyes closed, or you can do it with your eyes, as I say, watching the water. I'm going to lead you through this passage. Obviously, the way of prayer is usually done by people on their own. So it's actually better doing it on your own, I think, because you're not pushed along by a narrator like myself. But needs in leading it, I think it have to do it in this way. Allow the things to happen naturally, and if something happens that's not in the scripture, that doesn't matter either. Sometimes I think Jesus just touches us in our imagination in a different way. And towards the end of it, as it ends, we'll sort of look at what is God saying to me in this. And we can end with a formal prayer, have a moment to review it, and then share it in smaller groups. So I'd like to move into the story. Is everybody okay with that? So. Yeah, one is anyway. So that's enough water. So let's make sure that you're in a comfortable position, ideally in a position which is fairly attentive, yet, as I say, comfortable, grounded, with your feet on the ground is often good if it's possible. So let's just pause and come to stilling ourselves. Oops, sorry, what's going on? Oh, don't know quite, sorry if something's gone wrong with our. Just be quiet, we're sort of. So it's good to have a stilling exercise. One of the stilling exercises that I like best is the just to become aware of our own bodies. And that's maybe start with our feet. Just be aware of your feet. Can you feel the shoes on your feet? Can you feel the pressures? Are they warm or cold? And then moving up your calves. Again, you might be able to feel clothes on them. You may feel warm or cold. And then your thighs. You might feel the weight if you're sitting down, the weight of your body on them. the pressures. And then maybe your back. If it's tense, it often gets a bit tense. You can tighten it up and then slacken it and let it slacken a bit. Relax. You may feel the chair you're resting on. And then your front, your chest, you can probably feel your breathing, the movement of your breath, and perhaps the clothes moving against the body. And then your arms and hands. Again, you can perhaps feel part of the hands that are open to the air. Perhaps you can feel any breezes or different temperatures. And finally, your face, your head. Again, where the tension is often kept in the temples, the forehead. Just be able to move it around a little bit and tense it and then loosen the tension. Let the tensions go. And when we come to these prayers, we're in the presence of God. And we ask God to be our guide. Be with us, Lord, at this time. And guide our imagination so that whatever we imagine might be what you want us to hear. Let us too be aware of our own needs at this time. Maybe there's something we want to pray for. Maybe we just want to stay with that prayer of to know you more clearly, love you more dearly, and follow you more nearly. And so we begin to imagine this story from the Gospel. We begin with Jesus at the side of the lake, asking the disciples to get into the boat and go to the other side, while he dismisses the crowds and then goes up to the mountains to pray. So it's probably the end of the day, and by the side of the Lake Galilee, the disciples are being instructed to go to the other side, and he wants a bit of quiet time on his own to pray up the hill. So imagine who you might be in the story. Are you a disciple who's going to get into the boat? Jesus wanting time to pray? Are you one of the crowd who's been asked to go? Just spend a little time imagining the scene in Galilee. What's it like? How do you imagine it? And what are people saying to each other as they're going away from this situation where Jesus has been teaching and healing? So it's going dark and the wind's getting up. Be aware of how you are feeling here. What are you saying to the people around you? What are they saying to you? The disciples are trying to get to the other side, but the wind's against them. The night is passing. And early in the morning, when it's just becoming dawn, they see a figure walking towards them. Imagine this figure and your reactions. They shout, "It's a ghost," and they cry out in fear. They hear the answer, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And then Peter shouts out, "If it is you, command me to come to you over the water." And Jesus says, "Come." So imagine that, whether you're Peter, Jesus, or one of the disciples in the boat. How do you see that happening? How do you feel about it? You see Peter getting out of the boat and walking on water. And then when he looks around and notices a strong wind, he becomes frightened and has to call for help. And Jesus immediately reaches out his hand and catches him, saying, "You have little faith, why did you doubt?" How do you imagine him saying this? They both get back into the boat and the wind ceases. Spend a little time just imagining them getting back into the boat and the storm dying down. What do you think the people may have been saying, the disciples might have been saying to each other as they reach the shore and get out of the boat? Let's spend a moment now just either as yourself or as the character you were in the story. Just imagine yourself having a conversation to Jesus after that event, and what would you want to say to him, and what might he say in response? Imagine a conversation with him. And we finish our prayer with maybe a formal prayer like the Lord's Prayer. Just quietly to yourself. Okay, you can get up and shake yourself about now. We suggest that the next to move into small breakout groups. Did you manage to get into the story and imagine anything? If you did, what did you imagine? Did anything surprise you? And what do you think God might be saying for what you imagined? Like all these breakout groups and sharing groups, you only share what you're comfortable with. There might be things that come up that are personal that you don't want to share. That's fine, no problem. Just find something to share that you can share with others in the group. Of course, with the group too, you probably find you're with people you don't know, so it's always good to introduce yourselves, isn't it, at the beginning? Maybe to give a few minutes just to allow yourself maybe a minute's quiet before you start. Anybody starts after the introductions, you might want to just give yourself just a little time to to think back over the imaginative contemplation there, looking at that story of Jesus and the disciples, and then and what actually you did imagine, and then go around the group and spend 2 or 3 minutes, if you probably all you need, just to say what has happened with you in your group. So is that okay? That clear?
Great. We'll be in groups of 3 or 4 people for about 10 minutes, and hopefully a little message will come to you in about 5 or 6 minutes. 4 or 5 minutes is left.
Right.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
Thanks then, folks. And anything come up with in the groups? I mean, don't start telling somebody else's story, but anything that surprised you or you found that was common to the group or anything?
We can drop the spotlight on you, and then we'll be able to see everybody.
Okay. Oh, I can see everybody anyway.
Oh, good. Okay.
Well, feel free to I think if you raise your hand, you put, or if you raise the artificial hand, as it were, in the reactions button, you come to the front of the queue here, and you can be seen. Mark.
I just found it incredibly relaxing. One, having the water there and just looking at that. Yes. I found, well, in fact, I found, David, just the exercise just to relax me was enough.
Right. Okay.
And so for me, that was extremely relaxing.
Okay. Anything else? Anybody else?
There was some discussion in our group about the anxieties of the disciples, but also the anxieties of present day problems, whether it was COVID or COP26 and climate change. So the kind of chain of different anxieties that we're hit by, and the challenges that we face. So that was one theme that came up.
We can often do. I mean, we could. This image of being not walking on the water can often seem a COP22 sort of thing, the climate change and all that. You know, it does. It's that similar sort of thing, isn't it? Of are we keeping our head above water? Yeah.
Margaret had her hand up.
Right, Margaret.
I said to our group that I found it so much easier that you were an ordinary person, David. You didn't feel as though you were someone from on high telling us what to do. So it felt easier because it felt like if you could do it, it was worth us having a go.
Right. Oh, well, thank you very much. Yeah. I mean, it is only. That's why, I mean, one has to be tentative with these things. What I dislike, sometimes you'll get a lead version when somebody will come up and actually say, the sun was shining brightly, imagine the sun shining brightly, imagine this, imagine that, imagine the other, and telling you exactly how it is. but that's their imagination then, not yours. It's important that you allow yours to take over. So whether it's a sunny day or a rainy day, whether it's, you know, hot in Palestine or here in the chill of a Glasgow autumn sort of thing, it doesn't matter in a way, because it's what God can say to each individual. It's not a revelation for the world, it's something for you in your prayer. So I think, yeah, it's not like a preaching where you're sort of trying to get something that's going to be helpful to others. It's what God's saying to us. Okay, what I thought I'd do to finalize it is just to look at, just to go through the steps, if you like. So I think I can share my screen again. Hope that I don't have any. That's probably where we left off. I don't think there's any sounds on this, so I think I'm all right. Right, so they were the basic questions in the group. Did you get into it? If you did, what did you imagine? Anything surprise you? And then what we're saying now is really, what might God be saying to you through what you imagine? Because that's the fruit, if you like, of the prayer. So just to go through the stages of it, really, to choose a story at the beginning, to be aware of your own needs. I think we need to, that awareness, what am I needing? Particularly if we're stressed out, what do we want to be asking God for? Keeping our eyes on God is, as somebody was saying there, that's an important part of this. It's a time for God. Prayer is always, I think, a time for God, you know. Give God the time and ask God to be that guide, so that you're not thinking any old thing. You're thinking what God imagines. I've found in practice, though, over the years, giving retreats, and I've given retreats for many long years now, people do generally, if they look at what they have imagined, they do find some message or other, something that God is saying in it. Sometimes things will be dry. Sometimes you won't be able to get into a story. That may be God saying, well, that story is not ready for you at the moment. I have nothing to say to you through that story. You might have to move on to another one. And I think you too, gospel stories, you need a bit of time to do them. If you try and rush them, oh, I've got 10 minutes now, let's do one. I don't think they work terribly well. I think for me anyway, I find I need a bit more space. I need the space to just to relax and get into it. And that's what the stilling helps us with, various different stilling exercises. And this is, choose the passage, you're in the presence of God, ask for what you need, set the scene in the scripture, take your time, doesn't matter whether it's 2,000 years ago or today. Use the senses, they're often a great help. What do you hear? What do you feel? What do you taste? What do you smell? Become a person in the story. It matters too whether you're a disciple, somebody just in the crowd, watching from behind a pillar. That's telling you something about yourself. Nothing wrong with being any of those things, but it's telling you something about who you are. And then let the scene unfold naturally. The story might depart from a gospel scene and take on a life of its own. That's fine. Trust God. Everything human, I think, is appropriate material for prayer, even your own fears. Don't try and keep the language nice and pious just for God. He's heard everything, don't forget. And towards the end, I brought in that story a conversation with Jesus, or one of the main characters in the story, perhaps, or God himself. When the story finished, talk in your own words, as a friend, to God, or God the Father, Mary, one of the characters in the story, and imagine how they might reply to you. As I say, finally ending the prayer with the Lord's Prayer, the Our Father, is usually a good thing. So I throw it open to yourselves now, if you've any, let's just stop the sharing, and Any thoughts, comments, questions? Anybody can find it. Some people find it's difficult to use their imagination too, so that's fine. We could admit that. Mary, you saying something?
Yeah, I think so. Hope so. I think I've done some imaginative prayer, and I've actually been in the in Glasgow in
Right.
Rose Street. And I think one of the things that you said there earlier just really resonated with me. One of the things I really like is that you were saying there, using the senses. I find if I use my senses, I can get into the story much better. And so, like, if it's, well, say it's the Nativity, I mean, I bet that the cattle, I think the stable wasn't exactly smelling very sweetly. I mean, and all that sort of thing. And that actually, and it sounds trivial, but it actually does deepen your understanding, for me anyway. It deepens your understanding of the whole story and the whole thing that's happening. If you can get your senses in play. But that's just me. It maybe doesn't work that way for everybody else. But and actually, sometimes I find myself when I'm doing these using the Glaswegian accent, I don't sound like somebody in Israel. So I don't know. It's just me. Odd, maybe.
Oh, I mean, it's certainly in the spiritual exercise, it's something Ignatius encourages us to do at the end of a day. He reckons that's a nice ending of a day, to sort of just to be in a scene and just imagine yourself that, and just let the senses take you, really. As you say, though, it makes it human, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Very much so.
It was just noted in the chat box, the program or the methodology of take time. Some of us are probably certified to be directors of take time. It uses heavily the Ignatian contemplation methodology also.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you find it in various different places. The AA uses it in bits too. So there's a lot of, it's quite a positive anthropology, if you like. It sees people quite positively. It's that whole assumption that when you're doing, if you're sort of a half-decent person, when you're doing what is right, you feel good about it. There's a sort of positive nature, human nature, really. It's saying we're made for God, and we're, well, it's Augustine, and we're happy to when we rest in Thee. But there's something about that, yeah. Great. Perhaps I ought to, if there's no more comments or thoughts, then pass it along back to Hannah and her group to lead on.
Well, thank you so much, Father Birchall. I also really enjoyed just the calm in our busy lives, and for you trusting that it could happen through the internet, because some people are very skeptical. And thank you for your trust and allowing us to have this experience. If anyone would like to contact Father Birchall, his contact email will be shared in the chat box, and also the contact email for Peter Gardner, our second presenter, will be shared as well. So feel free to take those. They both agreed that they're open to being contacted.
And another thing that might be worth saying is that we do we've got quite a lot of material on this type of prayer online already. Some of the stuff that I was using there would be similar to what we've already got in the resources on our webpage. And also, we are Advent and Lent each year, we have a whole program of these sort of prayerful programs, basically, and that maybe it's worthwhile. What we've noticed more these days from the Ignatian Spirituality Centre here in Glasgow is that it's growing very much with outside, particularly outside the Roman Catholic Church. So in Church of Scotland, in Episcopal, and in the people like URC, and that we're finding a terrific amount of interest. So it's very much an ecumenical venture. Good.
Great, thanks.
Okay,
and if you'd be
thanks.
willing to put your website link, that'd be super, just to put that in the chat as
Well, there are
well.
2. Can I put 2 in?
2, 3, and also
um,
there's the Take Time one has been put up, so people, there are resources that are being shared in the chat box.
We do online prayer, which is a standard one, and then.
Great. I just want to make a quick reminder to people before we have a 5-minute break. We will post again the link to the PayPal in the chat box now. If you are so inclined to make a donation towards the costs of today and to the future work of the joint liturgical group, it'll be greatly appreciated. And yes, it goes through Salisbury United Reformed Church Treasury, but it does eventually get to the joint liturgical group. So we are going to take about a 7-minute break. We'll be back at 5 to 4. So thank you again, Father Birchall, and everybody take a break as you need it. Welcome back. There are a few messages in the chat box regarding if you're willing to do any evaluation of today's session. There is a general JL Joint Liturgical Group email, or you can send it to myself or to David Wallace, and we're happy to receive any evaluation, short or long. And thanks to those who are making donations through the PayPal link. We're glad to see it's working. Bless you. So now we are going to welcome our second presenter, Reverend Peter Gardner, who also lives and works in Glasgow. A visual artist and Church of Scotland minister, Peter studied at the University of St Andrews, Edinburgh University, and Leith School of Art. Ordained in 1988, Peter has served in rural and city center parishes and currently is the church's pioneer minister among the visual art communities of Glasgow. This month, he finalized an installation in Glasgow University Chapel. Together with his wife, Heidi, they formed the visual artist duo Gardner and Gardner. And their art practice focuses on temporary, site-specific installations and interventions, often set within the context of worshiping communities and their buildings, introducing a conceptual element into the sacred architecture and drawing attention to the sacred found in contemporary culture. We'll put the link to their website in the chat box. Peter's presentation, entitled Watch and Pray, Responding to Visual Art as a Practice of Prayer, will invite us all to open our eyes, to look with attentive curiosity, and to consider what we would choose to look at when we pray. Peter will help us reflect on the ways of seeing in everyday prayer as individuals and as worshiping communities. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Anna. It's very kind of you to give such a warm welcome. First of all, thank you to the Joint Liturgical Group for the invitation to say something today, because it really has prompted me to reflect on how attentiveness, or the disciplined practice of attentiveness, has been shaping my prayer life and my everyday prayers. I'm going to start off with what I would always do with when I was making an art piece. The first thing to do is to look at the site, look at the position it's going to be. What will frame the art piece? What building will it sit in? What wall will it be against? What space will it have? So when I think of prayer, the framing for prayer, like the framing of our screens here, is, for me, all prayer is a response to God, is a response to God's reaching out in love to the whole of creation, including us, of course, the whole of creation. Every moment, God is reaching out to creation, to all things, and is in all things. Much like David was saying earlier, when he was talking about everything human is appropriate material for prayer, God is in a conversation at all moments with every single creature, including us. If you want to have that biblically, you could find it in Colossians chapter 1. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things are created. Things in heaven and on earth, things visible, invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Paul goes on to say that all things are being reconciled to God through Christ, through his death on the cross, through his blood shed on the cross. There's a sense of all things were created, God is in all things, and the redeeming of all things in Christ is an ongoing process, an ongoing moment. If this is the frame for our prayers, as individuals and communities? What does attentiveness do to help us shape our prayer life? My ministry among artists, a lot of it is working as artists. Heidi and I, my wife and I, have a studio. This is where I'm sitting today. We have these postcards behind us on the wall. They've followed us around every studio we've been in. In fact, what you can't see, and I can see because I know it's there, but you can't see, is behind every postcard. There's a number because they've been in the same configuration in 3 different studios. Just in case you're wondering what's behind, and what you're actually seeing in this framing of this picture. For me, it's a pleasure because every day I look at them, I can see something, and every time I'm working, I can look up and they're there. And so much of our everyday life as artists is spent sitting in the studio or wandering around the studio, moving things around, hammering things together, tearing things apart. We get used to the space, and everything continues to speak in this space. What is every day is a huge part of an artist's work, the consideration of every day and how our senses interact with the everyday. So let's start off with something really everyday. I was making lentil soup on Sunday. You can't get much more everyday than lentil soup, can you? It's about the most common soup you'll find in any menu in any British restaurant. You can tell the kind of restaurants I go into. So I was making this lentil soup early on Sunday morning. Nothing more every day than that. I was chopping the veg. I'd got past the chopping the veg stage, and it was a case of digging out whatever's in the fridge. I was chopping the onion, the celery, the carrot. Found a yellow and orange pepper. A little rough cut, so I'm going to blend it. I didn't slice up things too small. Got it all into the pot, and I was just steaming it a little bit and a good look at it. And then I became attentive to the colours inside the stainless steel soup pot. There was the yellows and the oranges and the greens. And then what really surprised me was the sickle-shaped, moon-like shaped pieces of celery. It was a wonder. I found my heart exploding with joy and thanking God for celery. Celery! Come on, celery. That flavour that just hides in behind everything in the stock. Celery. Soup, just soup. Celery. Jesus instructs his disciples to watch and pray. Gregorio, Matthew 26:41. Be alert, be awake, be awake. Watch, be attentive. Throughout the rest of the afternoon, I'm going to concentrate a lot on our seeing. Now, all of this could be said for many of our senses. It could be any of them. E.E. Cummings describes us as tasting, touching, hearing, seeing, breathing, human merely beings. We are embodied, and everything we do in the world is embodied. We touch, we smell, we see, we taste, we hear. And so I'm talking about seeing. And for those of you for whom seeing is a problem, hearing might be your way of being attentive or touching. Or if you work in a restaurant, smelling. Sense of all these senses. Jesus asks us to be attentive. In the New Testament, you'll find there are so many words that involve seeing. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus uses the word katamanthano, which means we think of it as consider. Consider the lily, consider the flowers of the field. It's a big word though. It means reflect, pray, stop, think, work at it like a phenomenologist. For those of you who are into philosophy, phenomenology is a way of considering everything, every aspect, looking at it from above, behind, below, within. Consider, said Jesus. What would it be like if we could be as attentive as Jesus asks us, and the whole of creation, every day, keeping the same focus in the moment, not averting our eyes, not turning away from things we maybe not want to see. I think when we do that, our everyday prayer becomes an instinctive part of our lives. It's not easy to see, though. It's not easy to be attentive, to stop and watch, never mind pray. My first steps in art were learning the really difficult discipline of looking at Leith School of Art, surprisingly enough. It's a great wee art school. I'd recommend it to anyone. And I had to learn to observe what is there and not what I think is there. To observe what is there and not what I think is there. Not what I assume I'm seeing. New concepts like shape, form, light, tone, reflection, refraction, colour, shade, space, negative space, the space between things, objects and how they relate one to another. And was given tools to use to look more carefully: pencils, paper, charcoal, paint, clay, oil, water, plaster, wood, beeswax, steel, linseed oil. It was so exciting, so eye-opening. I remember coming back in the car once through Midlothian, where I was living, and writing in my journal afterwards about all the way the roofs of these pantile roofed Scottish villages turned into the colours of ice cream. I must have been hungry when I was writing it, but it was just this sense of seeing for the first time in a way I'd never seen before. In conversation with fellow students, we began to talk about, we're encouraged to talk about what motivates us into making. And what was lovely was people opened up and they began to talk about how one girl painted trees, and she's painted hundreds of trees and woods and forests, and she just loved to see the beauty of green. Amazing. Someone else pointed about the light, someone else looked at the space, someone was teasing out the relationship between objects. When he considered the world, that's what he saw. When I considered what I was seeing, I was slowly realizing that what I was encountering in the world were the glimpses of the same creator that I'd met when I first encountered Jesus Christ. When I first encountered Jesus within my soul, my heart, my spirit, and still encounter him daily and every day, I realized that I look at the world and he is reflected everywhere, not just in people, but in all things, as Paul wrote. Even in the Gospels, we discover that they found it hard to see. In John chapter 20, that moving story of Peter and John running to Jesus' empty tomb. And the Greek has all these different words for seeing. John looks into the tomb, blepo. He sees, he notices. Peter looks at the wrapped grave clothes, theorio, he observes, he examines. John perceives and believes, pistoio. And the rest of them, they didn't see, odia, because they didn't understand the scriptures. We have to learn slowly to see. It's a discipline of attentiveness. The everyday discipline of noticing, observing, being attentive to what? To wait means to stop, to watch, to open ourselves up, and to pray in response. Whether you're an artist making art, a crafter making a crafted piece, or someone who goes to a gallery to see a piece of art or stands and looks at the world, looking at what is there is the beginning of prayer. Christ is in all things, as Colossians tells us. From beginning to end, everything. And what is going on with creation goes on with us and without us. Annie Dillard, the amazing writer, if you've never read her book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, I'd advise you to have a go. It is most astonishing study of nature, and have a year spent in a rural valley in Vermont. It is a delight of a book. She writes, I think beauty and grace are performed whether or not we sense them. The least we can do is to try to be there. Everything relates to God, not to us. The whole of creation is not for our benefit. It's for its own benefit, to respond to God and reflect back to God. The thought that trees might be praising God in their own tree-like way. Insects buzzing in praise to God. Although in Scotland it's hard to imagine midges are part of that story, but still, we accept that. We have to learn that they too have their place in God's creation, and we too. But how do we free ourselves enough from an expectation of the world to see clearly, as the old Orthodox people would have us see, the logos, the logoi in all things, where God is giving himself so that they can relate back to him in praise. Artists could be our teacher here. Every work of art you look at reduces the whole complexity of creation to a small thing. In the beautiful woven tapestry piece you saw at the start in the prayers, the birds were just simple V's. A bird is not a simple V, but you look at the V and you know it's a flock of birds. It's beautiful. By reducing something to a small thing is not to take it away and make it less. It's to teach us so that when we go out into the world, we can see it as it is and relate to it as it is. Because sometimes the world is too crowded for our eyes. George Perec, the philosopher of the late 20th century, wrote this: the banal, the quotidian, the obvious, the common, the ordinary, the background noise, the habitual. How are we to speak of these common things? How to track them down? How to flush them out? To set them free from the dross in which they are mired? How to give them a meaning, a tongue? To let them finally speak of what is and who we are. This is what artists can give to us, a gift. 4 artists. Let's begin with Andy Goldsworthy. Here he is, painting mud on tree. He works in all over the world famous artist, but this is from rural Dumfriesshire in the south of Scotland. He's covered a tree partially, a mossy tree partially, in bands of mud. Does it not just stand out? Can you see the tree-like treeness of the bark, the shape of the boughs, in a way that would just pass you by as a mossy green tree? He brings it to life so we see the wonder of its treeness. Thank you to God for such a creation. Next slide, please. Poppies on a stair that doesn't really amount to very much. But the poppies bring out the shape, the wonder of steps, the risers, the flat step, the colour of the poppies. And of course, poppy has so many resonances in history. Andy Goldsworthy, in his art, is inviting us to stop and stare, to be attentive, to wait and to watch. Tells us something new about a stair we just walk right past or walk up and never pay attention to. Next slide, please. Here's Wolfgang Leib, German artist. He spends years collecting pollen from the fields and forests around where he lives. He asks us to draw our attention to the tiniest thing in creation, the vital pollen which enables life to happen. Without the pollen, there would be no trees. Next slide, please. When he spreads it on the floor of a gallery, the yellow of the hazel pollen or the pine pollen just sings. It is so yellow, and yet it floats in the air and we never notice it. Most of the time we hardly think of pollen unless we're hay fever sufferers or honeybees or insects. But here he draws our attention to a detail of creation that we might wonder with it and praise God. Next slide, please. Here he piles it up in the middle of a gallery. These 5 mountains are only 6 centimeters high. How long would it take to gather such pollen? How long would it take to be so attentive to a small part of creation? Every day he goes out with a small brush and his small jars and collects. Next slide, please. Lara Almar-Segui is an artist who asks us to see what's hidden behind the surface of things. This is in a gallery, or was in a gallery on 2010 in Vienna, called the Secession Building, the Vienna Secession, which was built in 1898. It's a most beautiful building. Inside, it's like every gallery, a white cube space. These mounds represent what is in the walls under the surface. Next slide, please. Lara examines it carefully and calculates out the exact quantities of the walls of the building, of the room you're in. She asks you to look at the walls of this building and every building and imagine what it contains. What huge proportion of creation is hidden and hardly seen, but imagined. Next slide, please. These piles of rubble are beautiful. My wife and I spent hours wandering around this space till we were thrown out because it was so still and yet hard to imagine the depth of creation behind a calm, grey wall is all this colour and beauty. Next slide, please. Jack Lerner, a Brazilian artist. She makes art out of the objects of her life. She's an artist, so artists, you spend most of your life working with tools, especially spirit levels. Anyone who's tried to hang anything in a gallery, in a house, anywhere, spends their life with spirit levels. The longer the better. It's easier to balance things, get them right. And here she puts them right in the front of the view so we can see them and think, oh, what is level? These are beautiful. Next slide, please. How many rulers do you have? How often do you try and find a straight line? Creation has hardly any straight lines. We have to make them. Leona reflects on the fact that she looks at rulers more than she looks at most other things. How beautiful they are when they're ordered and laid out in simple lines. Next slide, please. She's a smoker. She has collected over the years all the cigarette butts she has ever left behind. Every cigarette packet she has ever used. She has collected them and she makes art out of them. These cigarette papers, thankfully, she hasn't used. They're all on the wall. This is looking up at them and they form a kind of skin, as if to draw attention to something as small and as fragile and overlooked. Lerner writes, these objects are not my objects. They're everybody's objects. I want us to celebrate them to be attentive to them, to wonder at their creation. To see, to study, to look at things not as we would like it to be, but as it is. Not to ignore, but to examine. To wait, to watch, and to pray. To ask, what is this I'm looking at? And why have you made it? Such beginnings of praise, such beginning of thanksgiving. I think it's the beginning of prayer for the world in which we live. I'm going to invite you in a minute to do something different, to look out of your window. Next slide, please. This is looking out a window of a church in Garthamlock in the east side of Glasgow. These beautiful windows are set in one wall. There's 11 windows in one wall. What delights me about these windows is one of them is child height, so that it can see without having to crane its neck or stand on a chair. What do they see when they look out? What do you see when you look out of a window? Next slide, please. This is outside my kitchen window. Must have been a winter day when I took the photograph. And I was loving the light on the washing line and the shadows from the washing poles and the hint of frost. What do you see when you look out your window? Next window, please. Barbara Hepworth Museum in Wakefield. So much good art inside, and I looked out and there were these wonderful blank walls, blank windows, as if the building's eyes were closed, and a girl on a pink bicycle on an empty road. The wonder of the world. I'd invite you, if we could stop sharing the screen just for a second. I'm going to invite you to stop and stare, to do a strange thing on a Zoom. You've spent the last, let me think, 2 hours looking at these screens. I'm going to invite you to get up off your seats, if you can. If you're not able to, don't worry. Get up off your seats, go to the nearest window or any window and just look outside. Look and see what is there. Just take a minute or two. Have a good look. And when you're over there looking, what is it that delights you or terrifies you or bores you to tears about what you're looking at? I'm going to come back in after a couple of minutes and go into groups and talk about what we've seen. But go and have a look. Go on. You might be able to see there out the window from where you're sitting, but don't let that trick you, because you can only see the sky when you're sitting there. You can't see the ground from where you are. Come on back together, folks. Time is running on. Leave the delight of outside and come back to your screens. I'm going to offer you the opportunity to go into breakout rooms again, just for a few minutes. I think 7 minutes in total. And what is it you've seen? What do you feel about what you've seen? Where is God in what you've been looking at? What bubbles out of your soul when you're attentive to what you've just seen? Lovely to see you all back again. What if we could look at the world we're not so familiar with the same attentiveness? What I loved in our group was how we were able to describe very clearly what we could see, because it's a view we've looked at so many times and so often. And I think that's amazing that we can describe something to each other so carefully and so beautifully. But if the whole of our view was taken up with that kind of attentiveness, not just the familiar, but also the unfamiliar. So the first thing we do is wait and watch and pray with everything we encounter. We can do this as individuals, but what happens as a community, as a church? Because I think all of you are involved in churches. What happens as a church when we apply the same attentiveness? I'm going to have two examples of the practice of attentiveness to stimulate your thoughts. Jesus said, consider the lilies. I'm going to say, consider our church buildings. I am passionate about sacred architecture. A lot of the work that Gardner and Gardner do is set within the sacred, introducing some sort of contemporary art element into it. My heart warms with delight at sun-warmed sandstone. It's just a beautiful thing, the sun on the glistening sandstone. But I actually love concrete even more, the beauty of a concrete brutality building. Brutalism in art in churches is a great thing, I think. I wonder about the shape of many of our buildings in which we gather to worship, that they are so closed to the world. They have smaller windows, or sometimes they have large ones filled with stained glass. They obscure the world. They create small and large sanctuaries out of the world. And I know that at times I need, and everyone needs, sanctuary. But in terms of the practice of our prayers as community, I wonder if this withdrawing from the world can reinforce the idea that prayer is only something we can do away from the world, this wonderful world that God created in and through and for Christ. I served as a parish minister in Scotland in rural and city centre churches. I think I had 5 churches, church buildings I've worked in all. And all the churches had lovely stone walls, good oak doors, delightful, wonderfully made stained glass windows of some of the highest quality. They had high windowsills. I loved them all. I thought they were beautiful. Yet the architecture was formed and we were still living within the echo of the centuries old, and in my tradition's case, the Reformed practice of shutting out the world and its distractions so that we could gather around the word to allow no distraction to our hearing, seeing, and praying. Of course, we closed our eyes. We looked inward and downward. In my last congregation in a city centre, almost by accident, we developed a practice of opening our church doors every day during worship. Every day. For many of you, that's not new. It was to us. The church was a busy church with a big building attached to it, a cafe, a conference centre. Within the Scottish Presbyterian tradition, there's a kind of unspoken, inherited idea that the place of worship becomes the place of worship when the people who worship gather together. When they're not there, somehow it's just a closed building. So often Scottish church buildings are closed, except on Sunday mornings. Well, we found a door onto the street that hadn't been opened for 20 years. Thanks, Anne. We opened it onto the street. There was no barrier, no vestibule, just an open door. And the world flowed in, all its sounds, its sights, its scents, its life. As the poet Miroslav Holub suggests, open the door, at least there'll be a draft. We opened the door and people came in and people went out. We developed a series of art installations beside the open door as a way of developing our community's attentiveness every day. And it became a way of not radical looking and seeing, but radical listening. Peacemakers Project. Next slide, please. This is the Peacemakers Loom. It's a 181 centimetre in diameter French knitting loom, and its presence in the church had a transformational effect on our community's practice of prayer. Next slide, please. For 3.5 years, 2, 3, 5 days a week, myself and a team of people knitted and waited and welcomed and prayed. I made this loom with a architectural student, and we just sat it beside the door and knitted. Next slide, please. I would be knitting, and then you'd come in. I would hold the ball of wool while you knitted, and I'd listen, sometimes for hours. Another person would come in, and you would hold the ball of wool. You would become the host while they listened to you, and you listened to them. And so we listened and offered to pray. We had to stop ourselves telling about ourselves, about our church, about our wonderful church. We had to convince ourselves that it wasn't right to invite anyone to come on Sunday unless they asked about it. We had to just listen, to be utterly attentive to what they were saying. Next slide, please. And so the knitting grew. Next slide, please. And as we knitted with people, they felt as if they were part of something bigger, and each stitch became something they've said, a prayer. And in the listening, me to the person talking, I realized that they were listening to themselves talking. I was overhearing what they were saying. And in the listening, I realized that sometimes they were hearing the voice of God speaking to them in their own words. And I was listening. And sometimes I heard God speaking to me through what they were saying to themselves. Amazing. Occasionally, God would give me something to say after a long time of listening. Prayer became a response to all these layers of listening. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. It always is that slow attentiveness. When I was listening and imagining during David's wonderful, wonderful, imaginative Bible reading, I remembered the story of a lad came in around the Loom with his friend, and they were as cool as ice, two skateboarders who had the most expensive camera I've ever seen. And they were taking photographs of themselves skateboarding in the city of Glasgow. One put the skateboard down and started talking to the person who was there. The other started talking to me. And I said to him, would you mind if I asked you to do something? Would you mind skating up the middle of the church? And he looked at me for a second, and then he said, I'll think about it. And he worked the loom for a while. And without saying anything else, put his board down at the very back of the aisle of the church. And all I could describe as the most reverential, prayerful skate. He skated right down the middle of the church, stopped at the front, flipped his board up into his hand, and stood there for 5 minutes. A week later, he brought his girlfriend to visit us. And she could understand why he'd brought him to church. He had brought her to church on their first date. When we're attentive and listen and wait and hear with ears and eyes open, prayer begins for us and for other people. We developed a discipline of attentiveness where prayer becomes instinctive and shared. Wait and watch and pray, even when it's hard. The next art installation I want to share with you was a way of being repetitive when we were thinking about, oh, I missed that one, thank you, Anne. That's the ball of wool. It's now been used for something else, but it's 1.2 meters in diameter. Every stitch a prayer. Amazing. It's a privilege to be part of. Thank you. This next installation was a community's response to prejudice. Against the grain, we called it. In 2018, there were a number of sectarian incidents in Glasgow. In Glasgow, the endemic struggle with racism is complicated by the endemic problem of sectarianism. In Glasgow society and culture, in Glasgow churches, we struggle with this. Churches are working so hard together to overcome this. So we made this installation to help participants, people in this congregation in Anderston in Glasgow, pause and spend time with Jesus' words. First, remove the beam from your own eye, and then you will see clearly. See again, diablepo this time. You'll see clearly to remove the speck from your neighbor's eye. Some things are so hard to look at. So we decided that we would spend 8 days looking at this text. Next slide, please. We sourced a 2.4 meter length of windfall cherry wood and placed it in the middle of the church. Then we spent from morning till evening working it with files and rasps, attempting to reduce a log, a beam, to specks of dust and shavings. We opened the door and we welcomed literally hundreds of people who came and joined us in the work of reducing a beam to dust, a prejudice to nothing. There was laughter, there was silence, there was prayer, and what felt like to me a dialogue of our whole selves with God, a prayer that involved our bodies and our minds and our souls, about the prejudice that blinds us to our sisters and brothers, these images of God. There's something in the physical, repetitive action that enabled us to stay with a text that is so hard to look at constantly. Many of us look at it and turn away, but here for a week we faced this, and we faced our own prejudices this text gave to us. We prayed with many people around this as we shared the stories of our experience of sectarianism and many of the stories that people had experienced of racism. This church provided the space for the destitute asylum seekers to meet in the evening, and many of them came and talked with us. And so we had the same thing of listening and the eye-opening horror of the prejudice that sits against them. Instead of turning away, this practice enabled us to look and to see and not to withdraw. Next slide, please. I'm going to finish with this story, this piece. This piece was made during lockdown in the midst of the COVID pandemic. It's made in May, June 2020. It's called It's a New Dawn. I found lockdown very hard. Not only was it difficult to keep making, it was difficult to find a route to pray, although I met with a group of artists every morning to pray with them. I had to clear out my mother's house. She went into her care home on the day lockdown began. We were very fortunate that she was able to go in. She caught COVID in the care home, but she recovered, thankfully. But in cleaning out her house, I found her old sewing box, piles of ancient thread. She had always bought to do something with. I don't think she ever did. Not since me and my brothers were small anyway. She never would have had time. So as an act of prayer, I stretched a cord across the middle of my living room in the house and began to cut the thread and drape it over. Next slide, please. There were meters and meters. It took me weeks to do this, to cut, to measure, to pray, to drape, to cut, measure, pray, drape. Next slide, please. The process of constantly doing the same thing every day, enabled me to let my mind run and my thoughts enter into prayer, allowing me to rejoice at the light and the colours, to find joy in the midst of something that was really hard. Primo Levi, that amazing writer of the Holocaust, amazing Italian author, he wrote something that always stays with me, that in the most wonderful moments, there is a fly in the ointment. And the most awful times, there's a glint of sun. There is never complete joy or complete horror. There's always something else. And for me, this was a piece in lockdown that gave me that. Next slide, please. The light filling became a Pentecostal piece, as if the fire of the Spirit was setting light to the air in the room. The sunlight would pass through, but this caught it beautifully. Each thread cut and measured and draped carefully. Next slide, please. Repetition in every day. I think I'll stop there. I think that's probably enough at this stage. And I think I'm going to run out of time. I think I'm looking for Anna on her screen.
I'm here. I would like to invite people to go into breakout rooms. I don't want to go to the closing yet. We do have enough time for breakout groups, and I would like to invite you to share your responses to these prayer-filled installations. There's the Peacemaker Loom, the beam, and the threads of the new dawn light. And just to ask for yourself, how do they not, but how do they invite you into attentiveness and prayer? So let's go into those breakout groups. Thank you so much, Peter. One of the comments was, if we were in the modern Tate, we would love for you to walk us through so we could finally be attentive and see some sort of purpose and meaning in a pile of yellow pollen. So thank you for introducing us to the possibility of seeing in these new ways of presenting the world to be seen. Thank you so much. Before David, I just had to put my little thank you in there. David's going to do our closing thank yous. Before he does, I am going to do a couple little pieces of notice, a reminder that if you are willing to make a donation towards today's costs, please do so. There's a PayPal link that'll go up momentarily in your chat box. I mean, it's there way up, but it'll be put up fresh, I think. Also, the emails have just been put up for both David Birchall and Peter Gardner, who are happy to hear from you. And I think I wrote out some other things, but I don't remember all of them. But if you look through the chat box, other people have made suggestions of items that are shared. Oh, I know the other one I wanted to mention. If you would be willing to write any sort of evaluation, just there's emails in the chat box for myself, for David Wallace, and for the joint liturgical group, a general email. And we are very open to full criticism, positive and negative. But now I'll turn it over to David.
I would like to start with a huge apology, because usually when we meet together in London, and we've met past few years in St Aloysius in Euston, and one of the big things that we offer is hospitality. And it's so nice, isn't it, to be able to share food, a cup of tea or a cup of coffee with each other, and for Jen to run out and buy sandwiches for everybody who comes along. Unfortunately, it's not possible to do that. So it's a shame, and it's a bit of a loss. That's the downside of having to meet on Zoom. But just a few words of thanks. Thanks, first of all, to our IT team, to Elaine, Fiona, Joan, and Anne. I don't think I've said anyone there, who also helped to lead us in prayer as well. Thanks for all the donations. Thank you in a particular way to David. David has challenged us to think about how God speaks to us. And I think in a lot of what he said, I know in my own mind, I was thinking of how we've come through the past 19 months of a global pandemic with major lockdowns, with some of our churches being closed and having to reimagine how we worship together. You know, we've been fortunate with the likes of Zoom and Facebook and so on, YouTube, that we have been able to share in live celebrations, that we've been able to pray together, to worship together. That's been quite life-giving for us in lots of ways. It's so much better to be together, to be community, because that's where we're made. But I was thinking particularly when David was speaking, just about that presence of God in the experience of lockdown. Where is God in all of this? You know, we gain so much there from that stilling, the serenity, so much of the text that was figurative of what we have experienced. I was also quite taken by that beautiful comment that he's just an ordinary person, not telling us what to do from on high. And I think, David, that's the highest of compliments that you were paid there. Peter made me think of this beautiful summer that we've had. I've been fortunate enough living in the central part of Scotland to escape a couple of times, just to go for a drive, even for a few hours, and to admire the beauty of God's creation. And that the notion that you gave, Peter, of, you know, just appreciating even the very simplest or smallest of things, really just kind of, the sunlight this summer has really opened our eyes, I think, to seeing that and to experiencing the presence of God in his creation. I didn't encounter the midges so often, but the wasps certainly kept me at bay. So that was certainly something that was off-putting, but God's creation was certainly beautiful. There is so much to be thankful for, and I think that's come across this afternoon, that we do have so much to be thankful for. Thank you to all of you for sharing this time. It was a lovely way to spend an afternoon together, to reflect, to pray, to become more attentive, more aware of God's presence. And we're just entirely grateful to all of you for taking the time to be here. And hopefully we'll be able to meet either in this way or even better in person in the near future again as well. So on behalf of the whole Joint Liturgical Group of Great Britain, thank you.
Thank you, David. And now we turn back to Peter, who will be leading us in our closing worship.
A Call to Worship by Wendell Berry. It's called How to Be a Poet. Make a place to sit down. Sit down. Be quiet. You must depend upon affection, reading, knowledge, skill, more of each than you have inspiration, work, growing older, patience. Patience joins time to eternity. Breathe with unconditional breath. the unconditioned air. Communicate slowly. Live a three-dimensioned life. Stay away from anything that obscures the place it is in. There are no unsacred spaces. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. Accept what comes from silence. Make the best of it you can, of the little words that come out of the silence, like prayers prayed back to the one who prays. Make a poem that does not disturb the silence from which it came. There are no unsacred places, only sacred places. Here is a sacred place where you sit, the room you're in, and the screen you watch. Here, you and I encounter one another and meet with Christ. Next screen, please. Our reading. The sun is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body of the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from among the dead, so that everything might have, in everything, he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. This is stilled life, a bed sheet in our living room, made for Good Friday in April 2020. Stilled life, an image of suffering in a time of suffering. A temporary installation for Good Friday made in the artist's home. By Good Friday 2020, the global impact of COVID-19 was overwhelming. The number of people affected, the lists of those who had died, it was heartbreaking. All the normal structures and routines of life had been suspended. You'll remember it well. It is still happening. Such disruption had taken us all into those uncharted water, which are hard to navigate, and we need all the help we can to walk on. On Wednesday, the 8th of April, The Guardian published an article by Shan Shahota, a junior doctor working in ICU, who wrote, "Caring for a COVID patient is not what you think. I'm so close to them, dripping eye drops under the lids so that their unblinking eyes don't dry out. I may never meet them, but I hold vigil over the traces of their breathing for signs they need help. I change bed sheets from under them. I don't get to meet my patients, but what I want to say to them with all the force of my care is this: it's all for you. Everything we have, your life matters. These compassionate words distilled the overwhelming scale of the pandemic down to 2 human beings, one person tenderly cared for in an intensive care bed by another. It was these small acts, but significant acts of loving kindness, that became the catalyst for stilled life. The title came first, referencing the vigils kept at bedsides and the still point within the Good Friday narrative. The medium of the bedsheet hinted at the domestic focus of life under lockdown and alluded to the sheets and intensive care there on the intensive care beds across the world. Having spread the bedsheet on the floor, we began to gather and fold it, creating a relief sculpture of the figure of Christ stretched on a cross, which I hope you can glimpse. At first, the action was decisive: a twist of cloth to form a hand, a fold shaping the bulk of the shoulders, the stretched sinews of the arms, the turn of the lolling head. Folding the cotton to hint at the rib cage, the waist and hips, the contours of the legs, slightly bent, knees, wider calves, narrow ankles, the sharp curve of heels, feet turned to the left. As the figure emerged from within the folds, her actions slowed down, became more careful, each touch an act of devotion, of care, a prayer to the one whose form we were recalling. We handled the cotton lightly, tenderly, the way we would a body, a patient, a person. What do you see? What do you observe? What do you perceive? What does stilled life ask of you if you do not look away? What might God be saying to you as you consider this bedsheet? What prayer is forming in your heart, even as you look, even as the artwork begins to read you? Wait and watch and pray. If stilled life was made for Good Friday 2020, by Easter Day in 2021, we made another piece, a resurrection piece. We took communion cloth. In the Church of Scotland, there had been a tradition to cover the pew boards with white linen. It's rarely done now, a way of extending the Lord's table out across the entire church. Many of the linen is being thrown out. We took one length and took it into Pollock Park, Country Park in Glasgow, in dawn on Easter Day. Next slide, please. We made a path, interrupting the rough wood to catch the light of dawn, to catch the new light shining. the resurrection light. Next slide, please. It caught the light moving from the darkness into the light, asking us to follow it. We laid it where there was no path, just the initial growth of some bluebells and beech leaves under the tall beech trees. People walked on the path nearby and stopped. They put their dogs on leads to watch, to see. Next slide, please. Where does the path go? Where does this new light take us? This resurrection journey with the one who walked on water and calls us to follow him. Each day, we are caught between stilled life and a new light. We look east in winter for the sun to warm us, for the resurrection to meet us. Next slide, please. Risen Christ, you meet us each day and every day. The path of a wood. In the window through we look. You meet us today in our imagination, in the words of others, in what we have heard and we have seen. You will meet us tomorrow for every day. Every day you take us through life that has been stilled and invite us to journey with you in resurrection. You create a path where there has been no path, a bright path, a new way. And sometimes it is clear and we know how to begin and we know the direction you take us. And other times, the path is hidden. The folds of the journey unseen, but you are with us always. Risen Christ, we thank you. A resurrection poem. I thank you, God, for most this amazing day, for the leaping greenly spirits of trees and a blue, true dream of sky, and for everything which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes. I who have died am alive again today, and this is the sun's birthday. This is the birthday of life, of love and wings, and of the gay great happening illimitably earth. As you're tasting, touching, hearing, seeing, breathing, any lifted from the no of all nothing, human, merely being, doubt, unimaginable, you. Now the ears of my ears awake. And now the eyes of my eyes are open. I thank you, God. Amen.
Thank you. Peter, you have helped us touch the divine today. And to all of you, thank you for coming, for supporting the joint liturgical group in Great Britain. May you all take with you an enhanced sense of prayer for every day. God be with you all. I'd like to invite you all. This is a tradition we have at Salisbury United Reformed Church. You can unmute. It'll be absolutely cacophony. It's okay. And let us share together in the grace. And our tradition is we put our hands up so that the fingers just go off the sides of the screen, and so that we're touching each other. So if you're inside, go all the way outside.
Go to gallery view.
Yeah, you have to go to gallery view so you can see. If you're not on gallery view, take a minute to get there, and you'll be able to see where your hands are. And let us join together in the grace. The grace
Praise
of
our
Lord Jesus Christ,
And the love of God,
fellowship
of the Holy
Spirit,
with us all now.
Amen.
Amen. Go in peace.